Welcome to VBC Connects. I'm Todd DiPastino, and today we're talking to Bibi LeBlanc. And Bibi is a speaker, a writer, and author of Wings of Freedom, the story of the Berlin Airlift. Bibi is now working on a big project to capture and preserve and share firsthand stories from the airlift, that is, people who lived it and remember it. Hi, Bibi, how are you?
Hi, Todd. I'm great. How are you?
Good. I'm a historian. I'm an American historian, and I've always thought of the Berlin Airlift as kind of the finest, one of the finest moments of American 20th century history, and but I've never really considered it as much from the German side. What did you know about the Berlin Airlift? Because you grew up in Berlin.
That's a great question. I was born in the American sector of West Berlin in 1963, and growing up, I did not know anything about the airlift. I mean, I saw the monument that actually looks like this, and at Tempelhof Airport. And when I asked a grown-up, they'd say, "Yeah, but Berlin was airplanes were flying food into Berlin. They were landing every 3 minutes." That's all I knew. I knew nothing else. And then something happened about 4 years ago. The Tim Chope with the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation landed here at our local airport in DeLand, Florida. And it's a foundation dedicated to preserving the history of the airlift. And they equipped the airplane on the inside like a museum about the airlift. And so a friend of mine texted me and said, a candy bomber is coming to Berlin. I'm like, I don't know how she even connected me to this, but I took my mom out there to the airport because I knew she'd get a kick out of it. And because she has always told me that she, to this day, remembers the taste of the milk powder that came in with the care packages during the airlift. And so I thought taking her out there would really be meaningful for her, and it sure was. And the crew of the airplane was telling the story in a hangar of the airlift, and I raised my hand and I said, "We have a real airlift child here. My mom was there during the airlift." And they rolled out the red carpet for her. It was wonderful. And I shared a book with Tim about growing up in Berlin, Berlin Divided, Berlin United, a book I had published just before. And he's like, "You should do a book about the airlift." And I'm and I'm like, okay, one day I'll do that, but really didn't know anything about it. And then some other things happened, where like the stars aligned or whatever. The universe was sending me signs, and I'm like, I have to do this, and I have to do it now, because it turned out it was that year. The following year was the 75th anniversary of the airlift. So I, ordered all the books I could find about it, did a bunch of research, and I was just blown away by this chapter of our history. And it's a chapter of history we can all be proud of, you know?
And
And
it's a chapter of history that is important to the United States. It's important to Germany. It's important to the world because it came at
yes,
such an important time during the Cold War. And I love how it's important to you personally. This is kind of a way for you to, it sounds like, to connect to your own family, your own history.
yes. And I always like when I talk about it in my presentations, I always tell people I talk about growing up in West Berlin and what that was like, and visiting family we had in East Berlin, and going through the checkpoints and how scary it was, and how the apartment that my aunt and uncle and cousins lived in was bugged by the Stasi and all this stuff. I did not like growing up in a city divided by the wall. I felt it very acutely. And so my goal in life as a young person was to leave Berlin. And I did right out of high school and moved to West Germany. And so when I learned about the airlift, I realized that growing up with the wall was the lesser of two evil. Because had the men and women of the airlift not been successful in keeping Berlin, I would have grown up under the Soviets, under a communist regime, and probably the people of all of Germany, and who knows about Western Europe, because the Soviets far outnumbered their forces, military forces far outnumbered the Western military forces. And if it wasn't for the airlift, Our world today would look very different.
Some of our listeners, our viewers right now, might not know, they might be vaguely familiar with the Berlin Airlift, but do you want to give people a little bit of the history? It began, I believe, in June 1948, correct?
Yes, on June 24th, 1948, the Soviets blocked off the city. They cut off the power supply. The power plant was in East Germany. They closed the Autobahn for repairs. Um, they took up railroad tracks so trains couldn't come through, and the waterways, because all the supplies for West Berliners and the military forces had to come through the Soviet sector into Berlin. So they basically cut it off from the rest of the world.
So it was blockaded. A city of 2 million people in
Yeah.
West Berlin were essentially encircled by
Yes.
Soviet blockade. So that meant no food, no fuel, no
Yes.
medicine was
Yeah.
going into a city.
Yeah. Food supplies would last no more than a month at the time. What they had in Berlin, and coal they had for 6 weeks, and that was it. So they need to think of something and do it quick.
Yeah, they needed so the Allies, which were Great Britain, largely France and the United States, had to decide what are we going to do? Do we just hand the city over to the Soviets? That way, they at least they'll feed the people and they'll survive in West Berlin. Do we start World War III right here by,
Yeah.
blowing through the blockade? And this
And it,
ingenious and improbable solution came. Let's try and supply everything a city needs to survive by air, which
yeah.
was kind of a crazy idea.
And they could only do it because they had negotiated 3 air corridors into Berlin, with a signed contract, which they didn't have for the roads and waterways and railroads. So they had 3 corridors going into Berlin, and they used the northern and the southern one to fly into Berlin, and then the middle one to fly the airplanes out of Berlin.
And how long were these flights? How long were these cargo flights? They were just
It,
short hops, right?
yeah, it depends on which airbase they came from and what airplane they had, and so hour and a half, more or less,
So
from the
the plane
different.
would just kind of hop over the border, land at Tempelhof and maybe other airports in West Berlin, unload cargo, and then head right back and
Yes,
load up again. And I mean, it was 24 hours a day, was it not?
yes, yes. When weather allowing, like in during the winter, they had a lot of fog, so that became an issue. But other than that, yes. And General Tunner was a genius behind organizing all of that. He had airplanes flying in 5 different layers, 3 minutes apart, and divided by types of airplanes. And they had to fly mainly airport and Gatow. And for a while, they also landed on the water. They had British planes, the short Sunderlands, landing on the Havel River in Berlin. And yeah, I mean, it was a crowded airspace. And if they missed their approach, if they missed their landing, they couldn't just go around because there was too much traffic. They had to fly back to their base and try again.
Bibi, I remember very well reading this reading the story of the Berlin Airlift for the first time and reading that many days, 1,440 flights would land in East Berlin to deliver cargo.
In
And then
West
it would,
Berlin.
I'm sorry, in West Berlin and
Yes.
deliver cargo. And the book explained there are 1,440 minutes in a day. So there was that's one plane landing every minute for
Yeah.
24 hours.
At the height of the airlift, they did that. They had what they called the Easter parade. General Tunner, he was into competition and played the different air bases against each other and said, let's see what we can do. And yeah, that day they landed about every 60 seconds.
Was there ever a concern that the Soviets would shoot down a plane?
That was always a worry. They had to stay in the air corridors. It was 20 miles apart, and a couple of times, there were incidents that happened, and they always barraged the airplanes. Like they would shine floodlights at night to irritate the pilots. They would do air maneuver practices in that airspace that was reserved for the airlift, for the Western Allies. They tried all kinds of things.
And because Bibi, you're a Berliner and you speak German, as well as perfect English, um, it seems like you'd have access to people who, like your mother, who were children at the time, who remember this kind of deliverance from disaster, that came by these airplanes. What are their memories like?
Oh, it's so incredible and so touching, these stories, and when I published the book Wings of Freedom, that was the year of the 75th anniversary, and I went to several events where they had airlift children who are now in their 80s and 90s, and some veterans from the airlift, and I met some of them, and they started telling me their stories and what it was like back then. And I'm thinking to myself, somebody needs to record these stories. They're all going to get lost, if somebody doesn't preserve them. And so I started talking to a couple of people, Denise Halverson and some people at the airbase in near Wiesbaden. And they're like, why don't you do it? You already do books. And so last year I decided to start with it and take on this project. And I have a long list of people to interviewed. Some I've already interviewed. I've reached out to some people, have sent me, like Denise sent me her contacts and said, reach out to these people. I know them. They have great stories, and somebody at the base in Wiesbaden too. And then there are other organizations. So I started reaching out to people, and I spent 5 weeks in Germany in August, September, interviewing people who were children during the airlift. And it was just, some of these stories are just incredible. Movies should be made about this.
And a movie should be made about, you mentioned Denise Halverson, and she's the daughter of one of my all-time heroes, Gail Halverson. Would you mind talking a little bit about Gail and what he did?
Yeah, so he was this young pilot from Utah, and he arrived in Tempelhof one day, and he had a little bit of time, and he started talking to some kids at the airport fence. There was a group of 30 kids, and he was really amazed at their questions. They weren't begging for anything. They're asking questions. What are you bringing? How much can you fit in these airplanes, and how fast do they fly? And he was talking to them for about an hour or so. And before he's eventually he said, I have to leave now, and starts walking away. But he turned around and pulled out 2 strips of gum and handed them to the kids. And the kids divided the gum as much as they could, 30 kids. And they even cherished the wrappers, like the smell of the gum wrappers, right? And he's like, I will bring you more, but not here at the fence, but from the airplane. So he flew back to Frankfurt to his base that night and bought up the candy that, his candy allowance, and then thought about it like, I can't just drop Hershey bars or whatever he had out of the airplane, might hurt somebody. So he took his handkerchief and built a parachute and attached the candy. So the next day he flew back. Oh, and when he talked to the kids, one of the girls said, how do we know it's you? Because there's so many airplanes. And he said, I'll wiggle my wings. And so next day he flies back to Berlin, and he sees the kids waiting at the airport. He wiggles his wings, and his crew drop the candy. And then that turned into a big movement. Other pilots caught on and started doing it. And then school classes and church groups in the United States started collecting candy and handkerchiefs and, assembling parachutes and sending them over for the kids of Berlin.
People
And
have called what Gail Halverson did is the single greatest individual diplomatic initiative in history. I mean,
yes,
he really touched a generation
yes.
of West Berliners and West Germans with that simple act of dropping candy for children.
Yeah. And it just goes to show you, the impact one person can make with just a small gesture of kindness, just like Gail did. You never know the impact you might have. We're still telling the story almost 80 years later.
The United States rode a wave of goodwill for decades and decades and decades after the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift would come to an end the following year, right?
Mhm.
In May 1949, finally, Stalin and the Soviet Union kind of gave up.
Yeah, he
Uh,
realized they could maintain this forever.
yeah.
And so the blockade was lifted. The airlift actually continued until the end of September. The Americans kept flying, and the British until the beginning of October, because they just weren't sure, about the Soviets. They might decide to change their mind. And so they flew a little longer to build up the supply some. So the
BB,
airlift wasn't over with the end of the blockade, which a
right.
lot of people don't know. So
And BB, I don't know how much of the strategy you want to get in, the Cold War strategy that came into play with the airlift, but Harry Truman, who was president at the time, was advised by most of his
yeah,
advisors not to do it.
yeah,
Just let it go. It's going to be expensive. It's probably going to fail. It's going to be hard to coordinate. We had just fought this big war, World War II. This is an airlift that has never been attempted before. Just West Berlin does not have any strategic importance to the United States or to the what would become the NATO allies. Just let it go. We'll fight the Soviets on another battleground somewhere. Um, but Truman stuck with it. And what do you think was the result of that? What did the airlift do for the Allies in the Cold War?
well, it wouldn't have happened if he hadn't agreed. I mean, as simple as that. And if he hadn't agreed to it, the Soviets would have,
Taking
captured
West
West
Berlin.
Berlin. And that's, yeah, the West Berliners, that's what they were most afraid of, more than the hunger and the cold they suffered. They were worried about the Russians. Every story I hear, if people were old enough during the airlift to tell me about it, a lot of them remember what the war was like, but what the end of the war was like. And the bomb stopped. And then they're like, and then the Russians came. It gives me goosebumps, those stories that they have to share. Horrible. So they were very worried about.
Thank you for bringing that up, BB. I think many people who are from even those who are familiar with World War II don't know the full story of how devastated, and I mean absolutely flat on their back, devastated Germany was after World War II, destroyed. And the country really would not be rebuilt for well over a decade. Uh, at the time of the airlift, people were still living out of their basements. There was not, universal running water. There wasn't a lot of power. I mean, people were living in utter poverty. And then on top of that, you have the severe abuse that the Soviets delivered on, the people in their zone.
Yeah,
So this is a desperate country, a desperate people.
yeah, yeah. And yeah, Berlin was, some numbers say 70% destroyed, the buildings. So people shared a lot of times whatever space they could find. If they found apartments that were that were still standing and good enough to live in, they might not have had windows or anything, but they shared it with like several families if they had to,
It's
and
yeah,
yeah,
and this act of I think of kind of saving the city of West Berlin, I think it was a great exercise of what we would call today soft power on the part of the United States, kind of
yeah,
winning the hearts and minds of Western Europeans to join the United States in an alliance against the Eastern Bloc or the Soviet Union. It was ended up being a brilliant kind of military operation that achieved success, complete success, without fighting, but with kind of saving the city of 2 million people. I imagine, BB, that when you're
mhm,
talking to people who lived through it, children especially, who lived through it, it's opening up good memories, but also a lot of pain. I
yes,
imagine people talk about the war years and the post-war years and
mhm,
how their families suffered.
yes, very painful memories that they share. Women, like some women remember their mom like smearing dirt or coal into their faces to make them look old so the Russians wouldn't go after them. And stories like that, it's just incredible. Yeah.
BB, this project
So
voices
for
in.
this candy bomber to come in and drop candy, I mean, And then also the fact that they had to work together, the Western Allies with the Berliners, with the Germans, to unload the airplanes, because they, the Allied forces didn't have enough powers there, enough people, manpower. They had to work with the Germans, to unload the airplanes in the mechanics, the mechanical tasks. They had to work together. And all of a sudden, they had to learn to rely on each other and to trust each other, And that just 3 years after the war, is to me astonishing. 3 years earlier, they were trying to kill each other. And here they are working together, you know,
Yeah,
to
it's
save
remarkable. You could
Germany.
see pictures, Bibi, of, American pilots or crew members on the ground with these German
Mhm.
mechanics, and the German mechanics are wearing their Luftwaffe World War II uniforms. I mean, it's, there they
Because
are
they
working
didn't have
together.
anything else. You would have
Right.
people show up for work in a fur coat or in a bathing suit because that's all they had.
It's really a wonderful story, and I'm so glad that that it dawned on you that A, somebody has to get these stories while we still can, and B, you looked around and figured, I guess I'm the one who's going to have to,
It just, yeah,
collect these stories. This is the Voices of the Berlin Airlift, and you're kind of inviting anybody who has memories or family stories from the Berlin Airlift to contact you and share the story. I imagine you probably do a lot of phone interviews, maybe some, interviews like we're doing on Zoom.
yeah.
How would people contact you who kind of want to share a story?
They can call me and or email me or, any which through you. I don't know if you will post the contact information, but I can
Yes.
give you the number here right now or
Yes. Why don't you give the number here right now, and we will also put it in the comments, your email, your website, your phone number. I'll put all that information here in the description of the video.
okay. So my phone number is 386-228-5147. 386-228-5147. And my email is Bibi, that's Bibi, at wings-off-freedom.com. And
And
have
people
Todd will
could
post it.
that's how people could reach you through your website also, right? Wings
Yes,
dash
to the web.
of dash
Yes,
freedom.com. People could go
yes.
there. We'll put all that information in the comments. What are your plans for this collection? I mean, I imagine you're going to get so many stories and you'll probably have a choice to make of which ones to publish in book form. I hope that you're planning
Yes.
a book out of this.
Oh, definitely. Yes,
Mhm.
definitely going to be a book. And it's going to be a lot of stories from people who were airlift children or children during the airlift, veteran stories. I've captured quite a few, and there's still a few veterans alive. I walked into a museum recently, and the guy said, "We have a 102-year-old veteran who comes here who was in World War II and in the airlift." And he connected me, and I interviewed him, and he put on his uniform for me, right? And told me his story. But also there are people today like Tim Chope with the Berlin Airlift Historical Foundation who dedicate their lives to preserve this history. I want to get their thoughts too. Why do they think it's important to them, to do this? And any, people at museums that keep the story alive, and any family members who have had grandparents or family members. I met one woman who had journals from a veteran, airlift veteran. And so there are all kinds of different ways these stories are finding me. It's really interesting, the attention it's drawing now. And so, yes, I'm definitely going to turn it into a book. And I want to put out a really crazy idea here too. I would love, love, love. I feel like there has been a movie made. I mean, there's lots of documentaries about the airlift, and they're all about the logistics mostly. Many books have been written about the logistics of the airlift and what a feat it was, what they accomplished. My book is going to be more the human side of the airlift. I want to share those stories.
Yes.
And so there's one movie that people know that's been done about the airlift. To me, well, I'm not going to say a lot about it, but not the greatest movie. I would love to see a movie or a mini series made about the airlift, something like Band of Brothers, for example, because there's so much that could be told with this story and so much we can learn from it. I feel like we're so divided on all these topics and issues. The airlift can show us what we can accomplish as humans when we work together and communicate. And so I think it would be tremendous to have like a mini series like Band of Brothers made out of the airlift. And there are many amazing stories that could be told.
What a wonderful message and a wonderful mission, Bibi. Thank you so much for joining us. We're gonna stay in touch with you. I would love to have you kind of come on our VBC programs again and fill us in on some progress on the book. Thank you for joining us today. This is Bibi LeBlanc, Wings of Freedom and Voices of the Berlin Airlift. Take care, Bibi.
Thank you, Todd. Great being here.